In the early years of the Pacific War, the sky over the ocean felt like hostile territory for American pilots. Carrier decks rolled under gray clouds, and every launch into the blue carried a quiet fear. The stories spread quickly across ready rooms and wardrooms. Stories of a Japanese fighter that seemed untouchable, that could climb faster, turn tighter, and strike without warning. Pilots gave it a simple, almost reluctant respect. They called it the Zero. Before long, the Zero was more than just an enemy aircraft. It was a symbol of surprise and shock. When the war began, many in the United States had believed that American industry and engineering would naturally produce the best machines. Instead, in those early months, pilots flying the older F-4F Wildcat discovered the hard way that the enemy had something very special. In turning fights, the Wildcat struggled. The Zero could roll inside its arcs, slide onto its tail, and send lines of gunfire cutting through aluminum skin. Reports from the front described the same pattern again and again. A patrol would meet Japanese fighters. The first sighting might come as dots on the horizon, then as sleek silhouettes with long wings and rounded canopies. Then, too often, smoke trails and burning fuel marked the end of another American aircraft. Some pilots survived, bailing out into the open sea, clinging to life rafts while watching the sky above them. They remembered how the Zero seemed to hang on a wingtip, how it could pull impossible moves without stalling. In briefing rooms aboard carriers, officers pinned maps to bulkheads and traced arcs of enemy attack with chalk. They tried to turn scattered combat reports into something useful. Pilots who had faced the Zero returned shaken but determined. They spoke about the way the Japanese fighter could climb sharply after a dive, how it stayed controllable at low speeds, how it turned so quickly that a careless pilot would find the enemy right behind him in seconds. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. The Zero was fast, but not the fastest. It was agile, but lightly built. Some pilots noticed that it did not seem to take damage well. A few who had survived heavy combat swore that if they could just land solid hits, the Zero could be brought down. The problem was getting into a position to make those hits. The early American fighters, especially the Wildcat, were tough machines. They could absorb punishment and still bring their pilots home. But toughness alone did not win air battles. The Zero could choose when to engage and when to leave. It dictated the fight. On many days in the wide spaces of the Pacific, the United States Navy and Marine Corps felt like they were reacting rather than controlling. At the same time, far from the roar of engines and the smell of aviation fuel, engineers and designers on the American mainland were following these reports with intense interest. At Grumman, on Long Island in New York, the people who had built the Wildcat studied every scrap of information that came back from the Pacific. They had charts of climb rates, turn circles, and dive speeds. They had rough sketches made by pilots on notepads and mess tables. They had hard truths written in loss statistics. There was no doubt anymore. If the United States wanted to change the balance in the air, it needed more than incremental improvements. It needed a new fighter that could challenge the Zero on equal terms and then surpass it. A fighter with power to spare, strong enough for carrier duty, yet refined enough to hold its own in the tight-turning battles that had become so common over island chains and blue water. The pressure grew with every month of war. Carriers were precious assets, and the aircraft on their decks were the thin line shielding fleets from attack. When American task forces moved into contested seas, they did so under constant threat from enemy bombers escorted by Zeros. The sight of those long wings and pale paint schemes approaching in formation became all too familiar. Each enemy raid tested not only the skill of the pilots but also the limits of their machines. In letters home and quiet conversations between missions, pilots admitted their frustrations. They respected the Wildcat for its rugged construction and its ability to take damage. Many owed their lives to its sturdy frame and self-sealing fuel tanks. Yet they also dreamed of something more. They imagined climbing faster than the enemy instead of straining to keep up. They imagined having excess power to pull away in a pinch or to strike decisively when the opportunity appeared. The war in the Pacific was not just a contest of courage. It was a contest of design, production, and adaptation. On one side stood the Zero, the product of years of careful development by Japanese engineers who had anticipated the demands of carrier warfare. On the other side stood an American aviation industry that was still adjusting to the new reality of a global conflict fought across oceans. In the quiet moments after missions, when the noise of engines had faded and only the creak of a ship's hull and the low murmur of voices remained, some pilots wondered how long the Zero would rule the skies. They knew that somewhere, engineers were working. They hoped that those engineers understood the urgency felt out on the front line. Every delay meant more sorties flown in older machines, more close calls, more names added to casualty lists. Yet change was already beginning, even if many at sea did not yet know it. In design offices filled with blueprints and slide rules, a new idea was taking shape. It would not be a small revision of the Wildcat. It would be something larger, more powerful, and more forgiving to fly. It would be a fighter designed with the lessons of early defeats burned deeply into its structure. The war had revealed the strengths of the Zero, but it had also exposed its weaknesses. The challenge was to turn that knowledge into metal, rivets, and roaring engines. In the growing tension of those early war years, with the Zero dominating the Pacific skies, the stage was set for an answer that had not yet reached the carrier decks. An answer that would soon carry a new name and a new presence into the air. Far to the north of the warm Pacific, in cold winds and low clouds, the war touched a remote corner of Alaska. There, scattered islands with steep cliffs and mist-covered slopes became the setting for an event that would quietly reshape the air war. In the summer of 1942, during Japanese operations in the Aleutians, one of their Zero fighters was damaged and forced to land on a lonely patch of ground on an island called Akutan. The pilot tried to put the aircraft down on what looked like flat land, but the surface gave way, the Zero flipped, and the pilot was killed. For weeks the wreck lay undisturbed. Seabirds wheeled overhead and the wind blew across the bent grass and torn soil. The pale shape of the fighter slowly settled into the ground. From a distance, it was just another scar on a landscape that already felt harsh and unforgiving. No one on either side yet understood how important this broken machine would become. American patrols eventually found it. When the first team of pilots and ground crew walked up to the wreck, they realized that something remarkable had happened. The aircraft was damaged, but mostly intact. Wings, fuselage, engine, instruments, controls, all still there. This was not a charred shell or scattered metal. This was a nearly complete example of the very fighter that had dominated so many air battles. Recovery was not simple. The island was remote and the terrain rough. Yet plans were made and equipment brought in. Slowly and carefully, crews freed the Zero from the ground, lifted it, and prepared it for transport. Piece by piece, the enemy fighter began a second life, not as a weapon of the Japanese Navy, but as a source of knowledge for the United States. The aircraft was shipped south, away from the cold winds of the Aleutians and into the structured world of test fields and hangars. Mechanics cleaned it, straightened damaged sections, and repaired what they could. They replaced parts only when absolutely necessary, keeping as much original material as possible. Engineers and test pilots wanted to see the Zero as it truly was, not as a rough copy. When the time came, the captured fighter took to the air under American control. Test pilots taxied out, lined up on the runway, and felt the unfamiliar controls under their hands and feet. The engine roared to life, the tail lifted, and the light frame surged forward. As the wheels left the ground, the mystery of the Zero began to meet the reality of measured performance. Flight after flight, careful notes were taken. The Zero climbed well at moderate speeds, turned with an ease that confirmed every frontline report, and remained responsive in slow, tight maneuvers. Yet as the tests expanded into higher speeds and steeper dives, weaknesses appeared. At higher speeds, the controls grew heavy. The roll rate lagged. The aircraft did not like sudden changes at very high velocity. Engineers wrote these observations into reports that went out to commands across the Pacific. Tactical advice began to change. Instead of trying to outturn the Zero, American pilots were urged to use their comparative advantages. They were told to keep their speed up, to dive, strike, and climb away rather than stay locked in circling fights. The phrase hit and run, already familiar in other forms of warfare, gained new meaning in the sky. At the same time, the people at Grumman studied every detail they could obtain. They already had a new fighter on the drawing boards, an aircraft that would follow the Wildcat and improve on it in almost every way. The captured Zero did not start that design, but it sharpened the choices. The American Navy needed a fighter that could resist damage, that could fight from carrier decks in rough seas, and that could operate over long distances. Now it was also clear that it needed to be strong and fast enough to exploit the weaknesses revealed by the test flights. Grumman designers looked again at their plans. They favored a larger wing that could lift a heavier, more powerful engine. They reinforced the structure to handle high-speed dives and hard pullouts. They allowed room for thicker armor plates to protect the pilot and for self-sealing fuel tanks that could contain damage. When they thought of turning battles, they accepted that their new fighter might not match the Zero in the slowest, tightest circles. Instead, they aimed for an aircraft that could enter the fight on its own terms, using superior power and toughness. Reports from the Test Zero described how lightly built it was. Thin skin, minimal armor, no heavy protection around the pilot. That explained why it could turn so well at low speeds. It also explained why, when American pilots did manage to land clean hits, the enemy fighters often burned quickly. This contrast settled firmly in the minds of Grumman engineers. Their new machine would not be delicate. It would be a brawler, one that could take punishment and keep fighting. In offices lined with drafting tables, the lines of the new fighter grew more defined. The nose would house a powerful radial engine. The wings would carry heavy guns. The cockpit would be placed for good visibility during carrier landings. Every decision reflected a lesson learned in blood and smoke over the Pacific and confirmed by the captured Zero. Back out at sea, the pilots still flying Wildcats had no idea of every detail unfolding in those far-off workshops. They simply knew that they now had better tactical guidance. They practiced dives from altitude, learning to keep their speed high and avoid the tempting but dangerous turning duels that had claimed so many of their friends. The enemy had not changed, but the understanding of how to fight that enemy had deepened. In this way, the wreck on Akutan Island sent ripples all the way from a lonely patch of frozen ground to test fields, factories, and carrier decks. It turned raw fear of the unknown into precise data and clear strategy. Yet for all the progress in tactics and design, the outcome was still uncertain. The new fighter taking shape on the drawing boards had not yet flown into combat. The Zero still ruled many skies, and every day of delay was paid for by men who climbed into older aircraft and launched into dangerous missions. Slowly, metal began to follow pencil lines. Frames were laid out. Wings took shape under the hands of skilled workers in Bethpage, New York. Engines arrived and were fitted into place. The first prototypes rolled into the light, still unproven, still waiting for that moment when their wheels would leave the runway for the first time. The lessons of the captured Zero and the demands of a hard war now rested inside these new machines, silent for the moment, but ready to be tested in the air. In the Grumman workshops at Bethpage, Long Island, the war felt close even though the front lines were thousands of miles away. Every telegram, every combat report, every photograph of wrecked aircraft reminded the designers and workers that what they were doing was measured in lives saved or lost. The new fighter taking shape in their hangars was not an abstract project. It was a direct answer to the Zero and to the long lists of pilots who had not returned. They called it the F-6F, and soon enough everyone would know it by another name, the Hellcat. On the drafting boards its lines were bold. A big radial engine at the front, strong wings, a wide undercarriage suitable for carrier decks, and a cockpit placed high enough to give pilots a better view as they came in to land on moving ships. Compared to the earlier Wildcat, this new machine looked more muscular, as if it had been designed from the start to absorb punishment and hit back harder. The heart of the aircraft was its engine, a powerful double-row radial that promised a leap in performance. It would give the Hellcat far more power than the Wildcat had ever enjoyed. That power meant better climb, higher speed, and the ability to carry more fuel and more ammunition. But it also meant new stresses on the airframe. Grumman engineers reinforced key points in the structure, accepting added weight in exchange for strength. They knew carrier pilots would push the aircraft hard, diving steeply and pulling out just above the waves, slamming aboard with hooks down in all kinds of weather. While the aircraft was still taking shape, experienced combat pilots visited Bethpage to share what they had learned in the Pacific. Among the most respected voices was Edward Butch O'Hare, already famous for his daring defense of his carrier earlier in the war. He understood the realities of carrier combat better than most. He also knew what it meant to face the Zero in close and chaotic skies. O'Hare and other veterans explained what they needed from a new fighter. They wanted a machine that could climb with confidence to meet incoming raids, not one that struggled toward altitude. They needed range to escort bombers and stay over targets for meaningful periods of time, rather than turning for home too early and leaving strike groups exposed. They asked for good visibility, because the pilot who saw the enemy first often gained the critical first move. And they pressed for durability, because even with the best tactics there would always be sudden bursts of gunfire and stray fragments of metal tearing into wings and fuselages. Grumman listened. The Hellcat received thick armor plates around the cockpit and a reinforced windshield. Its fuel tanks were of the self-sealing type, designed to swell and close when pierced by bullets, reducing the chance of fire. The wings carried 6 heavy machine guns, 3 in each wing, giving the aircraft the ability to unleash dense streams of fire in a short burst. In design meetings, the memory of the captured Zero was never far away. The Japanese fighter's light construction had given it agility but made it fragile. The Hellcat would take the opposite path, trading a small measure of delicacy for a great deal of toughness. When the first prototype rolled from the factory into the sunlight, it was more than metal and paint. It represented months of urgency and years of accumulated experience. Test pilots climbed up the side of the fuselage, settled into the new cockpit, and learned the feel of its controls. The first flights were cautious. Takeoff runs, gentle climbs, simple turns, and steady landings. But with each successful circuit, confidence grew. Soon the test program expanded. The Hellcat was pushed into dives, rolled hard, and brought up to higher and higher speeds. It showed a personality that would later become famous among carrier pilots. It was stable, forgiving, and strong. It did not demand perfect handling from the pilot. If a landing approach was a little high or a little off-center, the wide undercarriage and sturdy frame could absorb the impact. If turbulence or battle damage disturbed the aircraft, it remained controllable. Engineers took notes after every flight. They adjusted cooling arrangements around the engine, refined control surfaces, and made small changes to improve handling at low speeds. They knew that the critical moment in carrier operations often came just as wheels were about to touch down, when an aircraft was slow, low, and vulnerable to stalls. The Hellcat needed to be trustworthy in that moment, because a mistake near the deck could mean not just the loss of a plane but damage to the ship and danger to the crew working on the flight deck. While testing continued, the production lines were already being prepared. Grumman organized its factories to build the new fighter in large numbers. Jigs and fixtures were put in place so that wings, fuselages, and tail units could be assembled in parallel. The scale of the effort was immense. Crates of parts arrived by rail and truck. Workers learned new procedures, new tools, and new quality standards. Many of them had never seen combat, but they understood that each rivet and each inspection mark was part of a chain that stretched all the way to a distant carrier. The demands of wartime meant that there was little room for delay. As soon as the test flights showed that the Hellcat was ready, the Navy moved quickly. Orders were placed in large quantities. Training units prepared to receive the new fighter. Manuals were written. Diagrams were printed. Pilots, many of them just out of advanced training, were told that they would transition from older types into a completely new machine that promised to change how they fought. Out in the Pacific, word began to circulate in mess halls and briefing rooms. There was talk of a bigger, faster fighter coming that might finally tilt the balance in the air. Details were scarce at first, carried by rumors and short official notices. Some pilots were cautious in their hopes. They had heard promises before and knew that no design, no matter how advanced, could remove the danger from combat. Others allowed themselves a quiet sense of anticipation, imagining what it would be like to meet the Zero again with more power under their right hand and more strength in the wings around them. The first production Hellcats stood in neat rows, engines quiet, canopies closed, waiting to be ferried away. They would soon cross the continent, then the ocean, to meet the war for which they had been built. In their design lay the lessons of the Akutan Zero, the hard experience of men like Butch O'Hare, and the determined work of thousands of anonymous hands on the assembly lines. For the moment, though, the Hellcat was still a promise rather than a legend. Its kill ratios were just numbers on paper, estimates based on performance charts and tactical assumptions. The real test waited far away, over blue water and scattered islands, where enemy formations still approached in disciplined lines and the Zero still carved tight turns in the bright Pacific sky. When the first Hellcats finally reached the Pacific, they arrived not as isolated prototypes but as full squadrons lined up on the decks of fast carriers. Fresh paint still shone on their fuselages. Their broad wings folded neatly for storage, then swung down and locked into place when the flight crews signaled that it was time to fly. To the pilots who walked across the non-skid deck and climbed the ladders into those new cockpits, the aircraft felt larger, more solid, and somehow more confident than the fighters they had known before. Training began at once. On practice flights over blue water, pilots learned how the Hellcat climbed, how it rolled, and how it behaved in high-speed dives. They found that if they pushed the throttle forward and let the big engine run, the aircraft surged ahead with a steadiness that inspired trust. It did not twitch or complain when pulled into sharp turns at speed. It simply dug in and followed orders. In carrier landing practice, the wide undercarriage and strong frame forgave small mistakes. Where a misjudged approach in an earlier fighter might have ended in disaster, the Hellcat often took the hit, bounced, and stayed in one piece. Yet the real measure waited beyond the horizon, where enemy scouts still searched for American task forces and Japanese strike groups still formed up over distant islands. The first combat tests came as carriers moved deeper into contested waters, launching raids against heavily defended positions. Hellcat pilots strapped in before dawn, listening to engines start one by one along the deck. As the sun lifted above the sea, they rolled forward in turn, felt the catapult or the full run of the deck beneath them, and lifted into the bright sky, climbing to meet an enemy they had studied but not yet faced in these new machines. It did not take long for the first clash to come. Over scattered clouds and dark ocean swells, radar operators and lookouts called out approaching formations. Bombers and attack aircraft tightened their groups as escorts moved to cover them. High above and slightly ahead, Hellcat divisions took their positions, eyes scanning for the familiar long wings and distinct silhouettes of Zeros. The pattern of air combat in the Pacific was about to be tested against a new piece on the board. In one of those early actions, a pilot named Robert Duncan flew a Hellcat into history. On that day, he was part of a fighter screen protecting American forces during a strike. When enemy fighters appeared, he and his wingmen moved to intercept. The Zeros came in with their usual confidence, expecting to meet the older types they had outmaneuvered many times before. Instead, they found themselves facing a fighter that could climb as they climbed and dive faster than they were comfortable following. Duncan used the advice drawn from the captured Zero and from countless briefings. He kept his speed up, avoided slow-turning contests, and chose his moment carefully. He dived, lined up his shot, and pressed the trigger. Tracers reached out in a tight stream. The enemy fighter that had been the terror of so many patrols shuddered as rounds struck its fragile structure. A thin smear of smoke trailed back, then thickened into a dark line as panels tore away. The Zero dropped out of control toward the sea. That kill was more than one mark in a logbook. It was the first confirmed victory of a Hellcat over a Zero, a signal that the balance in the air might finally be shifting. Word spread quickly from squadron to squadron. When pilots gathered in wardrooms after missions, they listened closely to those who had flown the new fighter in real combat. They wanted every detail. How did it feel in a dive with enemy aircraft behind? How quickly did it respond when thrown into a brake turn? How well could it climb away if things went wrong? The reports were encouraging. The Hellcat was not a delicate dueling blade. It was a strong, reliable weapon that let its pilots fight on terms that suited them. When used properly, it could dive onto enemy fighters, deliver a burst of fire, and then climb back toward altitude before the Zeros could recover enough speed to catch it. If forced into a closer fight, its toughness gave its pilot a second chance where a lighter aircraft might fail. As operations continued through late 1943 and beyond, more engagements followed. Over coral atolls, over open ocean, and in the skies around heavily defended islands, Hellcats crossed paths with enemy formations again and again. At first, Japanese pilots may have thought this new fighter was simply another version of the Wildcat. Soon, though, they began to learn that it could not be dismissed so easily. Mission records began to show a pattern. When Hellcats met Zeros in significant numbers, the losses on the American side remained comparatively low, while the Japanese units often came away badly damaged. Some days were still costly, because war in the air never became safe, but the ratio of enemy aircraft destroyed compared with Hellcats lost started to climb in a way that caught the attention of analysts. What had once been an uneven contest was turning into a series of engagements where the new fighter consistently came out ahead. Tactics evolved alongside the statistics. Hellcat squadrons flew in layered formations, with some aircraft positioned high to pounce on enemy fighters diving toward the bombers, and others kept closer to the strike groups as close escorts. The aircraft's power made it easier to shift between these roles. If a threat appeared at altitude, Hellcats could climb to meet it. If a gap opened lower down, they could dive and still have enough strength to recover. Slowly, a sense of quiet confidence began to replace the earlier unease that had shadowed missions against Zero-escorted formations. Pilots still understood the danger. They still respected the skill and determination of their opponents. But they no longer felt that they were stepping into the air with a machine that put them at an automatic disadvantage. The Hellcat gave them a margin of performance and protection that could turn a desperate scramble into a controlled battle. Back at analysis centers and headquarters, officers compiled results from dozens of actions. They compared sorties flown, enemy contacts, aircraft destroyed, and losses suffered. The numbers told a story that combat crews already felt in their bones. Engagement after engagement tilted in favor of the Hellcat. Over time, the emerging kill ratio reached levels that would have seemed impossible in the early days of the war. For every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat, enemy aircraft were being destroyed in far greater numbers, eventually approaching a staggering 19-1. Out on the carriers, though, the pilots did not recite ratios. They cleaned their gear, checked their aircraft, and prepared for the next launch. They knew only that they finally had a fighter worthy of the challenges of the Pacific. Above distant islands and endless water, the Hellcat was proving itself in the harshest possible way, one mission and one encounter at a time, even as larger battles and greater tests still waited ahead. By mid-1944, the Hellcat was no longer a rumor whispered in ready rooms. It was the standard shape on American carrier decks, its broad wings and tall fin forming long rows of blue silhouettes against the sea. The war in the Pacific had moved steadily west, and now the focus turned to a cluster of islands whose names would become tied to the greatest carrier battles of the conflict. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam lay ahead, and with them the Japanese fleet that still waited beyond the horizon. The plan to seize the Marianas meant more than just another step across the ocean. Capturing those islands would bring Japanese home territory within range of heavy bombers. Both sides understood what that meant. The Japanese Navy prepared a major response, gathering carriers and aircraft for a decisive blow. The United States Navy assembled its own forces, a powerful group of fast carriers escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On the decks of those carriers, Hellcat squadrons made last checks of guns, fuel systems, and radios, knowing that whatever came next could shape the course of the whole campaign. The tactical patterns that would guide them had been shaped by many influences. Among them were the ideas of Butch O'Hare, whose earlier actions had shown how a small group of fighters could shield a vulnerable carrier from overwhelming attack. Before his death in 1943, he had also helped pioneer night interception tactics, working on ways to bring radar-guided fighters into contact with enemy aircraft after dark. His insights into layered defenses and coordinated interception had filtered into doctrine, briefings, and standard procedures. Even though he was no longer there to fly among them, his influence lived on in the way fighter screens were arranged around the fleet and in the confidence with which squadrons accepted complex assignments. On the morning of 19 June 1944, radar screens aboard American ships began to show the first signs of what was coming. Distant contacts appeared, faded, then grew clearer as formation after formation of Japanese aircraft advanced. Carriers launched wave after wave of Hellcats to meet them, filling the sky above the fleet with circling fighters. Altitudes were layered. Some divisions waited high above, ready to dive into any attacking group. Others held positions lower, closer to the ships they were assigned to protect. The pattern matched countless training diagrams, but nothing in peacetime could match the scale of what was now unfolding. Among the pilots climbing into that sky was Alexander Vrashu. He had already proven himself in earlier actions, but on this day he would secure a place in aviation history. As the first Japanese attack waves closed in, Vrashu and his fellow Hellcat pilots moved to intercept dive bombers heading toward the fleet. Each side had its own priorities. The Japanese crews were focused on reaching the carriers and releasing their weapons. The Hellcat pilots were determined to break up the attack before it could fall upon the task force. Vrashu positioned himself above a group of enemy aircraft and dove. The Hellcat's powerful engine pulled him forward and down with speed to spare. He picked his targets one after another, making short, controlled bursts and then shifting to the next bomber. In a span of minutes that later reports measured at around 8, he destroyed 6 enemy aircraft. Each one that fell represented not only a loss for the Japanese but also a bomb that would never reach an American ship. What Vrashu experienced on that day was part of a larger pattern playing out across the sky. Time and again, enemy attack groups attempted to press through the fighter screen. Each time they met Hellcats flying in disciplined formations, using altitude, speed, and the aircraft's durability to their advantage. The captured Zero's weaknesses at high speed and in dives were now fully exploited. Hellcats attacked from above, then climbed back into the sun, avoiding the slow-turning fights where the older enemy tactics still tried to draw them. From the decks below, sailors watched the struggle in the sky as distant specks twisted and crossed, leaving faint trails that sometimes thickened into smoke. Columns of water rose where bombs fell short or torpedoes ran wild without guidance. Now and then, a parachute blossomed. For the most part, however, it was the Japanese formations that broke apart. Many of their pilots had less experience than the veterans who had flown the early campaigns. Against the combined pressure of improved American tactics and a superior new fighter, their losses mounted quickly. By the end of that day, the scale of the result became clear. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, and especially the aerial phase over the Marianas, would later be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a nickname that reflected the heavy Japanese losses and the relatively small number of American fighters destroyed in air-to-air combat. Hellcat pilots returned to their carriers with stories of multiple kills, some registering 3, 4, or more enemy aircraft shot down in single sorties. The numbers were tallied with care. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft had been lost in the attempts to strike the American fleet, including many carrier-trained crews that could not easily be replaced. The Hellcats' emerging kill ratio, already impressive before this battle, climbed even higher. Analysts reviewing the engagement noted that the combination of radar early warning, layered fighter cover, and the Hellcats' performance had created a defensive shield far more effective than what the fleet had possessed in the early years of the war. Yet there was still no sense of celebration on the flight decks. Pilots climbed down from their cockpits exhausted, their faces marked by wind, strain, and the knowledge that luck always played some part in survival. Ground crews moved quickly among the returning aircraft, checking for bullet holes, fuel leaks, and stressed parts. Empty ammunition belts were replaced. Oil streaks were wiped away. New fuel was pumped into tanks. For every Hellcat that had come back unscathed, there were others bearing scars, their skin torn and patched, their paint scorched by near misses. Even as the Japanese carrier air arms suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover, the war did not simply stop. The Marianas campaign continued. Landings took place on beaches backed by steep ridges and heavily defended positions. Hellcats shifted roles as needed, flying not only as pure interceptors but also in support of ground forces, strafing targets, and providing cover over the beaches. The wide wing and sturdy frame that had made them such good carrier fighters also allowed them to carry bombs and rockets when required. Still, the memory of that day over the Marianas lingered in every ready room. It was there, in the chalked diagrams of intercept angles and altitude stacks. It was there in the rows of small victory symbols painted carefully beneath cockpit canopies. And it was there in the growing realization that the Hellcat was doing more than just matching the Zero. It was surpassing it so thoroughly that the very nature of carrier air warfare in the Pacific was changing. Behind the headline numbers, a deeper story was taking shape. More and more pilots were achieving ace status, reaching 5 or more aerial victories in remarkably short periods. Some did so in a handful of missions. Others accumulated their tallies steadily across long campaigns. The Hellcat, with its blend of power, resilience, and forgiving handling, was helping ordinary but well-trained flyers perform at levels once reserved for the most exceptional individuals. Yet for all the success, larger challenges remained to the west. The Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the waters that surrounded them still lay ahead. The enemy might have lost many of its finest pilots and aircraft, but it still held vast stretches of territory, numerous airfields, and a fleet that could still fight at sea. The Hellcat had proven that it could dominate a major air battle. The question that now hung over carriers and planning rooms alike was how far that dominance could extend as the war drove closer to the Japanese home islands.